In the sweltering summer of 1939, the world stood on the edge of an absolute abyss. What followed was not just a war, but a global cataclysm that would redefine the meaning of human cruelty and unimaginable courage. Imagine a struggle so vast it consumed 60 million lives. A world where mighty empires crumbled in mere weeks, and the fate of entire civilizations rested on the shoulders of weary men in muddy trenches and young pilots in burning skies. In this film, we will take you through the darkest corners of human history. From the secret, cynical pacts that ignited the flame, to the near miracle at the beaches of Dunkirk. We will witness the frozen, blood-soaked ruins of Stalingrad, where the German war machine finally met its match, and the terrifying roar of the 1st Panzer divisions that shook the earth. We will cross the Pacific, island by bloody island, and stand on the shores of Normandy during the greatest invasion the world has ever seen. We will explore the chilling reality of the final solution and the haunting, silent dawn of the atomic age. This is not just a collection of dates and names. This is the story of the rise and fall of the most terrifying military force ever assembled. This is the ultimate sacrifice of a lost generation. This is the total, unfiltered chronicle of World War II. Welcome to the War Archives. Let the history begin. The world on the brink. In the late summer of 1939, the fragile peace that had held for 20 years finally shattered. World War II was not a new conflict, but a continuation of the unsettled disputes left behind in the wake of the First Great War. It would become the largest and bloodiest struggle in human history, involving nearly every corner of the globe and resulting in the deaths of 40 to 50 million people. By early 1939, the German dictator Adolf Hitler had fixed his sights on Poland. To achieve his goal of eastward expansion, he first needed to neutralize the threat of the Soviet Union. In a move that stupefied the world, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact on August 23rd and 24th. Hidden within this cynical agreement was a secret protocol. The two powers agreed to divide Poland between them. The western third would go to Germany, and the eastern two-thirds to the USSR. Hitler believed this agreement would prevent British or French intervention. On August 31st, 1939, at 12:40 p.m., he issued the final order. The following morning, at 4:45 a.m., German forces crossed the border. The response was immediate. On September 3rd, Great Britain declared war at 11 a.m., followed by France at 5 p.m. The Second World War had begun. In 1939, the Allies, Great Britain, France, and Poland, possessed superior industrial resources and a larger total population. However, the German military, the Wehrmacht, was the most efficient and effective fighting force of its size in the world. Germany mobilized 100 infantry divisions and 6 armored divisions. While the Allies had a significant number of tanks, they lacked the specialized organization that Germany had perfected. Under the doctrines of General Heinz Guderian, German tanks were not scattered among infantry, but massed into panzer divisions. These formations, supported by motorized artillery and motorized infantry, were designed to punch holes in enemy lines and encircle them with terrifying speed. Overhead, the Luftwaffe provided devastating support. This was the birth of the Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War, the fall of Poland and the Winter War. The German invasion of Poland was the first true demonstration of high-speed armored warfare. Poland's frontiers were long and exposed, and its army, though courageous, was woefully outmoded. Clinging to the belief that horse-mounted cavalry could still play a major role, the Polish High Command was overwhelmed by 1,500,000 German troops. The Luftwaffe paralyzed the country, bombing rail lines, bridges, and power stations. By September 8th, German armor reached the outskirts of Warsaw. On September 17th, the situation turned from desperate to hopeless. Soviet forces invaded from the east. The Polish government fled into exile. Warsaw held out under brutal bombardment until September 28th, but the country was conquered and partitioned between the two invaders. While Poland was being carved up, the Soviet Union turned its attention to the Baltic states. By October 10th, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were forced to admit Soviet garrisons. Finland, however, refused. On November 30th, 1939, the Soviet Union launched an attack with 70 divisions and 1,000 tanks. To the world's surprise, the small Finnish army of 200,000 men humiliated the invaders. In the deep forests and frozen lakes, the Soviets were repulsed on almost every front. It was not until February 1st, 1940, that the Red Army launched a massive, methodical assault on the Mannerheim Line. After a fortnight of pulverizing artillery fire, the line was breached. On March 6th, Finland was forced to sue for peace, ceding the Karelian Isthmus and other strategic territories. The Blitzkrieg in the West. For months after the fall of Poland, a strange calm settled over the Western Front, often called the Phony War. The French relied on the Maginot Line, a massive system of underground fortifications stretching from Switzerland to the Belgian border. They believed it was impregnable. On May 10, 1940, the storm finally broke. Hitler launched the invasion of the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. The Dutch army, lacking tanks and modern experience, was overwhelmed in days. After the terror bombing of Rotterdam, the Netherlands surrendered on May 14th. In Belgium, German airborne troops captured the vital fortress of Eben-Emael in a daring glider assault. As the British and French armies rushed northward into Belgium to meet the German advance, they fell into a meticulously prepared trap. The French believed the hilly, wooded Ardennes forest was impassable for tanks. They were wrong. General Erich von Manstein's bold plan sent Rundstedt's Army Group A, more than 1,500,000 men and 1,500 tanks, straight through the Ardennes. By May 13th, German forces reached the Meuse River at Sedan. Supported by 1,000 dive bombers, they shattered the poorly equipped French defenders. Within days, a 60-mile-wide breach opened in the French front. Guderian's tanks raced toward the English Channel, reaching Abbeville on May 20th. The Allied armies in the north were now completely cut off from the south. The British Expeditionary Force and the remnants of the French army were pushed back toward the sea. The miracle of Dunkirk. By late May, the Allied forces were trapped in a shrinking pocket around the port of Dunkirk. On May 24th, a strange and controversial order came from Hitler. He stopped the advance of his armored divisions. This gave the British a narrow window to organize an evacuation. Operation Dynamo began on May 26th. Every available craft, from destroyers to private fishing boats and pleasure yachts, was pressed into service. Under constant air attack, 850 vessels ferried troops across the Channel. By June 4th, 338,000 men, including 140,000 French and Belgian troops, had been saved. While their heavy equipment was left behind, the core of the British Army survived to fight another day. On June 5th, the Germans launched a new offensive southward. The French resisted stiffly for 2 days, but they were outnumbered and exhausted. On June 10th, seeing the imminent collapse of France, the Italian leader Benito Mussolini declared war on Great Britain and France, hoping to share in the spoils of victory. The Germans entered Paris unopposed on June 14th. 2 days later, the French government was reformed under the aged hero of World War I, Marshal Philippe Pétain. On June 22, 1940, in the same railway carriage where the 1918 armistice had been signed, France surrendered. The armistice divided France into 2 zones. The north and west were under German military occupation, while the south remained nominally sovereign under the Vichy regime. General Charles de Gaulle, however, fled to London, broadcasting a defiant call for the French people to continue the resistance. The Battle of Britain and the Blitz. With France defeated, Hitler expected Great Britain to seek peace. When Prime Minister Winston Churchill refused, Hitler ordered preparations for an invasion, codenamed Operation Sea Lion. To succeed, the Luftwaffe first had to destroy the Royal Air Force and win control of the skies. The Battle of Britain began in earnest in August 1940. The Luftwaffe, led by Hermann Göring, launched massive raids against British ports, airfields, and radar stations. Britain's survival depended on fighter command, led by Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding. Though outnumbered, the British possessed a critical advantage: radar. This early warning system allowed the RAF to intercept incoming bombers with deadly precision. The Spitfire and the Hurricane proved superior to many German aircraft. In late August, after a British raid on Berlin, a furious Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to shift its attacks from airfields to London and other cities. This period, known as the Blitz, saw months of nightly bombardment that devastated civilian populations. However, this strategic shift allowed the RAF to recover. By mid-September, it was clear that the Luftwaffe could not win air superiority. On September 15th, German losses reached such high levels that Hitler was forced to postpone the invasion indefinitely. The Battle of Britain was a decisive victory. For the first time, the Nazi war machine had been halted. The Balkans and the Desert War. While the air war raged over Britain, the conflict expanded into the Mediterranean and the Balkans. On October 28, 1940, Mussolini launched an invasion of Greece from Albania. It was a disaster for the Italians. The Greeks not only halted the attack but drove the Italians back into Albania. Hitler was forced to intervene to secure his southern flank and protect the Romanian oil fields. In April 1941, German forces invaded both Yugoslavia and Greece. Using the same Blitzkrieg tactics that had won France, they crushed all resistance in weeks. Yugoslavia surrendered on April 17th, and Athens fell on April 27th. A massive airborne invasion of Crete in May 1941 followed, resulting in the capture of the island, though at a heavy cost to German paratroopers. In North Africa, the war was a seesaw struggle across the western desert. In late 1940, the British launched a counteroffensive that nearly destroyed the Italian army in Libya, taking 130,000 prisoners. To save his ally, Hitler sent the Afrika Korps under a brilliant young general, Erwin Rommel. Arriving in February 1941, Rommel immediately launched a bold offensive. By April, he had reconquered nearly all of Cyrenaica and driven the British back to the Egyptian frontier, leaving only the port of Tobruk as a besieged Allied outpost. The Desert War had become a grueling conflict of supply lines and tank maneuvers. Operation Barbarossa, the Giant Awakens. In the early morning hours of June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler launched the most ambitious and catastrophic military operation in history, the invasion of the Soviet Union, codenamed Operation Barbarossa. Over 3 million men, 3,000 tanks, and 7,000 artillery pieces were unleashed along an 1,800-mile front. This was to be more than a military campaign. It was a war of extermination, fueled by Nazi racial ideology and a desire to crush Soviet communism forever. The attack took the Soviet leadership, headed by Joseph Stalin, completely by surprise. The Red Army was caught in an unprepared and partially demobilized state. 3 German army groups surged forward. In the north, Army Group Lieb struck toward Leningrad. In the center, Army Group Bach, led by the armored spearheads of Guderian and Hoth, raced toward Moscow. In the south, Army Group Rundstedt advanced into the fertile lands of Ukraine toward Kyiv. The initial success was staggering. Within days, German tanks converged at Minsk, taking 300,000 prisoners. By mid-July, they reached Smolensk, only 200 miles from Moscow, capturing another 200,000 Soviet troops. However, beneath this surface of victory, the first cracks in the German plan began to appear. The Soviet soldiers fought with a stubbornness the Germans had never encountered in the West. Even when encircled, they continued to block roads and supply lines. Furthermore, the vastness of the Russian landscape began to take its toll. Heavy rainstorms turned sandy roads into impassable mud, stalling the wheeled transport needed to supply the tanks. The Soviets also employed a scorched earth policy, destroying crops, bridges, and factories as they retreated. Entire industrial plants were dismantled and shipped by rail to the east, beyond the reach of the German Reich, to be rebuilt in the Ural Mountains. As August arrived, Hitler and his generals argued over the final objective. While the High Command urged a direct strike on Moscow, Hitler insisted on diverting forces to capture the economic resources of Ukraine and the oil fields of the Caucasus. This delay proved fatal. Although the Germans achieved a massive encirclement at Kiev in September, capturing over 500,000 men, the clock was ticking. By the time the final drive on Moscow, Operation Typhoon, was launched in October, the Russian winter was approaching. The gates of Moscow and the Russian winter. By late October 1941, the German armies were exhausted. Their supply lines stretched to the breaking point. The autumn rains had turned the landscape into a morass of mud. But as November arrived, the temperature plummeted. The mud froze, allowing the tanks to move again, but it brought a new horror: the sub-zero temperatures of a Russian winter. The German soldiers were not equipped for such conditions. Without winter clothing, thousands succumbed to frostbite. Their equipment failed, oil thickened in engines, and weapons jammed. Despite these hardships, on December 2nd, German detachments managed to penetrate the suburbs of Moscow, so close they could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. It was the limit of their strength. On December 6, 1941, the Soviet commander General Georgy Zhukov launched a massive counteroffensive. Fresh, well-equipped Siberian divisions, accustomed to the brutal cold, struck the German lines. The invaders were tumbled back, haunted by the specter of Napoleon's disastrous retreat a century earlier. Hitler forbade any general retreat, forcing his men to stand and fight in advanced positions. While this may have prevented a total rout, the cost in human life was astronomical. By the end of the winter, the German army had suffered over 700,000 casualties. The dream of a quick victory in the east was dead. Infamy in the Pacific. While the fires of war consumed Europe, a new storm was gathering in the Pacific. For years, Japan had been mired in a grueling war in China. To sustain its industrial economy and military machine, Japan looked southward to the resource-rich colonies of the Netherlands, France, and Great Britain. The primary obstacle to Japanese dominance was the United States. Relations between Washington and Tokyo deteriorated rapidly. In July 1941, after Japan occupied southern Indochina, the United States responded with a devastating oil embargo. For the Japanese leadership, this was a death sentence for their empire. They calculated that they had only months of fuel remaining. Faced with the choice of a humiliating withdrawal from China or a desperate gamble for resources, they chose war. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto conceived a daring plan: a surprise strike against the United States Pacific Fleet at its base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. On Sunday morning, December 7, 1941, 360 Japanese aircraft launched from 6 carriers struck the base. The attack was devastating. All 8 United States battleships in the harbor were hit, with 4 sunk. Over 2,300 American servicemen were killed. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stood before Congress, declaring December 7th, a date which will live in infamy. The United States was now at war. However, the Japanese victory was incomplete. Crucially, the 3 American aircraft carriers were at sea during the attack and escaped unharmed. Pearl Harbor's oil storage and repair facilities also remained intact. By attacking without a formal declaration of war, Japan had unified the American public in a way nothing else could, awakening an industrial giant that would eventually overwhelm the Japanese Empire. The Japanese Surge. In the months following Pearl Harbor, the Japanese military launched a coordinated blitzkrieg across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. On the same day as the Hawaii attack, they struck United States airfields in the Philippines, destroying half of the American air strength in the region. The fall of the Western outposts came with breathtaking speed. Hong Kong surrendered on Christmas Day, 1941. In January, Japanese forces swept down the Malay Peninsula. On February 15, 1942, they achieved their greatest triumph, the capture of Singapore. The British fortress, thought to be unassailable, surrendered along with 90,000 troops. It was the largest surrender in British military history. In the Philippines, American and Filipino forces under General Douglas MacArthur made a desperate stand on the Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor Island. Suffering from hunger and disease, they were finally forced to surrender in May 1942. MacArthur was ordered to escape to Australia, famously vowing, "I shall return." By the spring of 1942, Japan had secured a vast empire stretching from Burma to the mid-Pacific. They controlled the rubber of Malaya, the oil of the Dutch East Indies, and the rice of Indochina. They seemed invincible, but their momentum was about to hit a wall. Midway, the turning of the tide. The first check to Japanese expansion came in May 1942 at the Battle of the Coral Sea. It was the first naval battle in history where the opposing fleets never saw one another, with the fighting done entirely by carrier-based aircraft. While the battle was a tactical draw, it was a strategic victory for the Allies, as it forced Japan to abandon its invasion of Port Moresby in New Guinea. Seeking a decisive showdown, Admiral Yamamoto targeted Midway Island, a strategic outpost in the North Pacific. He hoped to lure the remaining American carriers into a trap and destroy them. However, American intelligence had achieved a miracle. They had broken the Japanese naval code. Admiral Chester Nimitz knew exactly when and where the Japanese were coming. The Battle of Midway, fought between June 3 and June 7, 1942, changed the course of the war. In a single day, American dive bombers caught the Japanese carriers while their decks were crowded with fueled and armed planes. In a matter of minutes, 4 of Japan's premier aircraft carriers, the heart of their fleet, were sent to the bottom of the ocean. Midway was the turning point of the Pacific War. Japan lost its strategic initiative and its best-trained pilots. From this moment on, the naval strengths of the two nations were virtually equal, and the United States began to shift from defense to the long, bloody road of the counteroffensive. The Desert Duel. El Alamein. By the summer of 1942, the war in the North African desert had reached a critical climax. The Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, had captured the vital port of Tobruk and was racing across Egypt, seemingly unstoppable. His goal was the Suez Canal, the jugular vein of the British Empire. By June 30th, the German and Italian tanks were pressing against a tiny railway halt known as El Alamein, just 60 miles from the city of Alexandria. The First Battle of El Alamein throughout the July 1942 marked the end of Rommel's rapid victory dreams. His troops were exhausted, and their supply lines were stretched across hundreds of miles of desert. General Claude Auchinleck managed to halt the Axis advance, but it was a new arrival who would change the fate of the Desert War, General Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery took command of the 8th Army and refused to attack until he had overwhelming superiority in men and material. By October, the British had over 200,000 men and 1,000 tanks, while the Axis forces were crippled by a lack of fuel and supplies due to Allied naval dominance in the Mediterranean. In the night of October 23, 1942, under the light of a full moon, a massive artillery barrage signaled the start of the Second Battle of El Alamein. It was a brutal struggle through deep minefields and intense anti-tank fire. After 12 days of fierce combat, Rommel's line finally broke. Despite Hitler's stand-and-fight orders, Rommel was forced into a massive retreat across 700 miles of desert. The threat to the Suez Canal was over forever. The road to the Volga, Case Blue. While the British were preparing their counterstroke in Egypt, Adolf Hitler launched a new, massive summer offensive on the Eastern Front in June 1942. Codenamed Case Blue, the objective was the oil fields of the Caucasus and the industrial city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. Hitler believed that by seizing Soviet oil and cutting the Volga transport artery, he could finally drain the Soviet Union of its ability to wage war. The German Army Group South swept across the Russian plains with terrifying speed. In July, Rostov-on-Don fell, opening the gateway to the Caucasus. However, Hitler made a fatal strategic error. He split his forces. He ordered one group to push into the Caucasian mountains and another, the Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus, to capture Stalingrad. The Sixth Army, composed of 330,000 of Germany's finest troops, approached Stalingrad in late August. The city, a 30-mile-long industrial center, was pounded into rubble by the Luftwaffe. But the ruins became a fortress. Under the command of General Vasily Chuikov, the Soviet 62nd Army stood its ground in a desperate house-to-house struggle that would become the most concentrated fighting of the war. Stalingrad, the turning point. The battle for Stalingrad was a descent into hell. In the ruins of factories and apartment blocks, the fighting was so close that it was often measured in rooms rather than streets. By mid-October, the Germans had pushed the Soviets back to a narrow strip along the Volga River, but they could not deliver the final blow. The German soldiers were becoming dispirited by heavy losses and the looming shadow of another Russian winter. Unknown to the Germans, the Soviet High Command, led by Zhukov and Vasilevsky, was preparing a massive trap. On November 19th and 20th, 1942, two powerful Soviet spearheads struck the weak flanks of the German line, which were held by poorly equipped Romanian and Italian troops. In just 4 days, the pincers met 60 miles west of Stalingrad, encircling the entire German Sixth Army. Hitler refused to allow Paulus to break out, promising that the Luftwaffe would supply the trapped army by air, a promise that could not be kept. In the freezing cold of the Stalingrad pocket, the German soldiers starved and died. On January 31st, 1943, Paulus, recently promoted to field marshal, surrendered. 91,000 starving men and 24 generals went into captivity. It was the greatest defeat in German military history and the definitive turning point on the Eastern Front. Guadalcanal, the jungle of death. As the tide turned in Russia and Egypt, the United States launched its first major land offensive in the Pacific. The target was a small jungle-covered island in the Solomons, Guadalcanal. In August 1942, the 1st Marine Division poured ashore to seize a strategic airfield the Japanese were building. What followed was 6 months of some of the most savage fighting of the war. In the dense jungles, American Marines and soldiers fought off waves of suicidal Japanese night attacks. At sea, the waters around the island became known as Iron Bottom Sound, due to the dozens of warships sunk in a series of brutal naval engagements. The Japanese, unable to properly reinforce or supply their troops, suffered from starvation and disease. By February 1943, they were forced to evacuate the island. Guadalcanal was a psychological and strategic victory for the Allies. It proved that the Japanese soldier was not invincible and marked the beginning of the island hopping campaign that would lead all the way to Tokyo. Operation Torch, the Allied return. In November 1942, the Western Allies opened a new front in the war. Codenamed Operation Torch, a massive Anglo-American force under General Dwight D. Eisenhower landed on the coasts of Morocco and Algeria. This was the first major amphibious operation conducted by the Americans in the Atlantic Theater. The landings were complicated by the fact that the territories were controlled by the Vichy French. After brief but sharp resistance, the French authorities in North Africa concluded an armistice and joined the Allies. In response, Hitler ordered the immediate occupation of the Free Zone of southern France. The Allied goal was to trap Rommel's retreating forces between the 8th Army coming from Egypt and the Torch forces coming from the west. The Axis responded by pouring reinforcements into Tunisia, winning the race for the capital city of Tunis. However, by May 1943, the Axis forces in Tunisia were surrounded and cut off from all supplies. Over 250,000 German and Italian troops surrendered. North Africa was finally cleared, opening the door for an invasion of southern Europe. The shadow of the swastika, the final solution. Amidst the global conflict, a darker and more systematic horror was unfolding in German-occupied Europe. Driven by Hitler's fanatical racial ideology, the Nazi regime unleashed the final solution of the Jewish question. This was the systematic, industrialized genocide of the Jewish people, along with Slavs, Romani, and others deemed inferior. Beginning with mobile killing squads in the Soviet Union in 1941, the Holocaust moved into a new, even more terrifying phase in 1942. Death camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, and Belzec were established in occupied Poland. Millions of people were deported in cattle cars from across Europe to these factories of death. By the end of the war, 6 million Jews and millions of others had been murdered. This genocide was not a byproduct of the war, but a central aim of the Nazi state. It remains the darkest chapter in human history, a reminder of the absolute evil that the Allies were fighting to defeat. Casablanca and the advance on Sicily. In January 1943, Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill met at Casablanca to chart the future of the war. It was here that Roosevelt announced the policy of unconditional surrender, making it clear that the Allies would accept nothing less than the total destruction of the Axis regimes. They decided that the next blow would fall on Sicily, the soft underbelly of Europe. In July 1943, the Allies launched the largest amphibious operation to date. Despite the rugged terrain, American and British forces swept across the island in just 38 days. The fall of Sicily had an immediate political impact. The Italian leadership turned against Benito Mussolini. On July 25th, the Italian king ordered Mussolini's arrest, and a new government began secret negotiations to surrender to the Allies. The first of the three Axis powers was about to collapse. The Italian grind, Salerno to Cassino. The invasion of Sicily in July 1943 was the death knell for Mussolini's regime. But for the Allied soldiers, it was only the beginning of a long and bloody climb up the Italian peninsula. On September 3, 1943, the British 8th Army landed on the toe of Italy, and the Italian government secretly signed a capitulation. However, the Germans were not ready to give up Italy. Under Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the German forces quickly occupied the country, disarming their former allies. On September 9th, a mixed American and British force launched a daring landing at Salerno. They were met by a ferocious German counterattack that nearly pushed them back into the sea. It took a week of desperate fighting and massive naval bombardment to secure the beachhead. The Italian campaign soon turned into a grueling war of attrition. The rugged Apennine Mountains and numerous rivers provided the Germans with perfect defensive positions. By the winter of 1943, the Allied advance was halted at the Gustav Line, a formidable chain of defenses anchored on the historic heights of Monte Cassino. For months, the Allies would batter themselves against these mountain fortresses in a struggle that recalled the static horrors of the First World War. Kursk, the death of the Panzers. While the Allies struggled in the mountains of Italy, the greatest tank battle in human history was unfolding on the rolling plains of Russia. In July 1943, Hitler launched Operation Citadel. a massive offensive designed to pinch off a large Soviet salient around the city of Kursk. Hitler threw everything he had into this gamble. 3,000 tanks, including the new heavy Tiger and Panther models. But the days of German surprise were over. Forewarned by intelligence and the long German preparations, the Soviets had transformed the Kursk salient into a vast fortress of minefields, anti-tank ditches, and layered defenses. When the German panzers struck on July 5th, they were ground down in a battle of unprecedented violence. By July 12th, the German offensive had stalled. The Soviets, who had held their best forces in reserve, launched a massive counteroffensive. At the village of Prokhorovka, hundreds of tanks clashed in a swirling, smoke-filled melee at point-blank range. The Battle of Kursk was a catastrophe for the Wehrmacht. They lost nearly 3,000 tanks and 70,000 men. From this point on, the Germans would remain on the defensive on the Eastern Front until the end of the war. The War in the Clouds. Strategic bombing. By 1943, the war had returned to the German homeland in a terrifying new form. The Royal Air Force and the United States 8th Air Force began a massive strategic bombing offensive designed to destroy Germany's industrial heart and break the will of its people. The British Bomber Command, under Sir Arthur Harris, focused on area bombing at night, targeting entire cities. In July 1943, the Battle of Hamburg resulted in a firestorm so intense it killed 40,000 people in a single week. Meanwhile, the Americans conducted daylight precision raids against specific targets like aircraft factories and oil refineries. The cost for the Allied airmen was staggering. Without long-range fighter protection, the heavy bombers were vulnerable to German interceptors. Raids on cities like Schweinfurt saw nearly 30% of the attacking force shot down. It was not until the arrival of the P-51 Mustang, a fighter capable of escorting bombers all the way to Berlin, that the Allies finally won control of the skies over Germany. Island hopping, the road to the Marianas. In the Pacific, the United States was perfecting a new and effective strategy: island hopping. Rather than attacking every Japanese-held island, the Allies bypassed and isolated strongholds, seizing only those with strategic airfields or harbors. In late 1943 and early 1944, the encirclement of the massive Japanese base at Rabaul was completed, rendering 100,000 Japanese troops useless. The focus then shifted to the Central Pacific and the Mariana Islands. Seizing Saipan, Tinian, and Guam was critical, as they would provide bases for the new B-29 Superfortress bombers to strike Japan directly. In June 1944, the invasion of Saipan triggered the Battle of the Philippine Sea, also known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese Navy lost 3 aircraft carriers and over 400 planes, effectively ending their ability to conduct large-scale carrier operations. The loss of the Marianas was a shock to Tokyo. Prime Minister Tojo was forced to resign, and for the first time, the Japanese leadership realized that the defense of their home islands was now imminent. The Big Three and the liberation of Rome. In November 1943, the Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, met for the first time in Tehran, Iran. It was a historic meeting that would shape the final phase of the war. Stalin demanded a second front in Western Europe to relieve the pressure on the Red Army. Roosevelt and Churchill finally committed to a massive invasion of northern France in the spring of 1944. Meanwhile, in Italy, the deadlock at the Gustav Line was finally broken. After 4 bloody battles for Monte Cassino, the Polish Corps captured the ruins of the monastery in May 1944. Simultaneously, Allied troops broke out of the Anzio beachhead. On June 5, 1944, American troops entered Rome, the first Axis capital to be liberated. But the triumph in Rome would be overshadowed within 24 hours by an event that would change the world forever. D-Day, the Great Crusade. On the morning of June 6, 1944. D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history, began. Under the supreme command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, over 150,000 American, British, and Canadian troops landed on the beaches of Normandy. Code-named Operation Overlord, the invasion involved an armada of nearly 7,000 ships and 12,000 aircraft. The Germans, deceived by an elaborate Allied misinformation campaign, were caught off guard. While resistance was relatively light on some beaches, the American landing at Omaha Beach turned into a slaughterhouse. Trapped against the sea by intense machine gun fire, it took hours of desperate bravery to breach the coastal defenses. By nightfall, the Allies had established a precarious foothold in France. Over the following weeks, they poured millions of men and tons of equipment onto the continent. Despite the dense hedgerow country of Normandy, which favored the German defenders, the Allied air superiority and industrial weight were overwhelming. The long-awaited liberation of Western Europe had begun. The breakout and the liberation of Paris. For 7 weeks, the Allies were hemmed into the narrow confines of Normandy. The breakthrough finally came in late July 1944 with Operation Cobra. General George S. Patton's Third Army smashed through the German lines at Avranches and flooded into the open country of Brittany and central France. The German army in the west began to collapse. At the Falaise Pocket, tens of thousands of German troops were surrounded and destroyed. As the Allied columns raced toward the east, the French resistance in Paris rose against the occupiers. On August 25, 1944, a French armored division entered the city, and Paris was liberated after 4 years of Nazi rule. To the world, it seemed the war in Europe might be over by Christmas. Operation Bagration, the German collapse in the east. While the Western Allies were securing their foothold in Normandy, a storm of even greater magnitude was breaking on the Eastern Front. On June 23, 1944, 3 years to the day after the Nazi invasion, the Soviet Union launched Operation Bagration. This was a massive onslaught aimed at the German Army Group Center in Belarusia. The scale was unprecedented. The Red Army unleashed over 2 million men and 6,000 tanks. In a matter of weeks, the German front was vaporized. Bastion towns like Vitebsk and Minsk fell, and nearly 30 German divisions were annihilated. By mid-July, Soviet tanks had raced 450 miles, reaching the outskirts of Warsaw and the borders of East Prussia. The German army had suffered a defeat far greater than Stalingrad. As the Soviets reached the Vistula River, the Polish Home Army in Warsaw rose in revolt against the retreating Germans. In a tragic turn of history, the Soviet advance halted on the outskirts of the city, allowing the Germans to brutally suppress the uprising. Meanwhile, in the south, Romania and Bulgaria collapsed and switched sides, opening the way for the Red Army to sweep into the Balkans and toward the Hungarian plain. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the naval climax. In the Pacific, the United States was ready to fulfill General MacArthur's promise. In October 1944, a massive American armada converged on the island of Leyte in the Philippines. To stop them, the Japanese Navy launched Operation Victory, a desperate gamble involving nearly their entire remaining fleet. The resulting Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought from October 23 to 26, 1944, was the largest naval engagement in history. It featured the first organized use of kamikaze suicide attacks, as Japanese pilots deliberately crashed their bomb-laden planes into American ships. Despite this new terror, the battle was a decisive American victory. The Japanese lost 3 battleships, including the monstrous Musashi, and 4 aircraft carriers. But the Japanese Navy was effectively finished as a fighting force, clearing the way for the liberation of the Philippines and the eventual invasion of the Japanese home islands. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last gamble. By December 1944, the Allied advance in the West had slowed as they reached the borders of Germany. Hitler, desperate to turn the tide, drained his last reserves for one final offensive. He aimed to strike through the wooded Ardennes forest, the same route he had taken in 1940, and capture the port of Antwerp, cutting the Allied armies in two. Launched on December 16, 1944, in heavy mist and snow that grounded Allied aircraft, the Battle of the Bulge took the Americans by surprise. A massive German wedge was driven into the Allied lines. At the town of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded but refused to surrender, their commander famously replying, "Nuts," to the German demand. The gamble failed. As the weather cleared, Allied air power decimated the German columns, and General Patton's Third Army struck the German flank. By January 1945, the Bulge was eliminated. Hitler had spent his last remaining panzer divisions and fuel reserves, leaving Germany's western borders defenseless for the final assault. The fall of the Reich across the Rhine. In early 1945, the leaders of the Big Three met at Yalta in Crimea to discuss the final defeat of Germany and the post-war order. They agreed on occupation zones and the Soviet entry into the war against Japan. In March 1945, the Western Allies finally breached the last natural barrier to the heart of Germany, the Rhine River. American troops captured the bridge at Remagen intact, while Montgomery launched a massive, coordinated crossing in the north. The German defense collapsed, and American and British tanks flooded into the German heartland, encircling the entire industrial Ruhr Valley. From the east, the Red Army launched its final offensive toward Berlin in April. Zhukov and Konev's armies, numbering over 2 million men, hammered at the Oder River defenses. By April 25th, Soviet and American troops famously met and shook hands at the Elbe River, cutting Germany in two. The death of the dictator and the surrender. By late April 1945, Berlin was a city of ruins, surrounded and under constant Soviet artillery fire. Adolf Hitler, isolated in his underground bunker beneath the Chancellery, finally accepted the end. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet troops were just hundreds of yards away, Hitler committed suicide. His successor, Admiral Karl Dönitz, sought to surrender to the Western Allies while continuing to move as many troops as possible away from the Soviet advance. On May 7, 1945, at a small red brick schoolhouse in Reims, France, the unconditional surrender of all German forces was signed. The following day, May 8th, was declared VE Day, Victory in Europe. The Thousand-Year Reich had lasted little more than 12 years, leaving a continent in ruins. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the Atomic Age. Though the war in Europe was over, the struggle in the Pacific grew even more savage. To secure air bases for the final invasion of Japan, the United States targeted the volcanic islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The Japanese defenders, hidden in vast networks of caves and tunnels, fought to the death. The Battle of Iwo Jima in February 1945 cost 6,000 Marine lives, while the struggle for Okinawa in April was the bloodiest of the Pacific War, with over 12,000 Americans and 100,000 Japanese killed. The intense kamikaze attacks off Okinawa convinced American planners that an invasion of the Japanese home islands would result in over 1 million casualties. Seeking a way to end the war without such a slaughter, President Harry Truman authorized the use of a new, terrifying weapon, the atomic bomb. Developed in secret under the Manhattan Project, the first bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The destruction was unlike anything the world had ever seen, with tens of thousands killed in an instant. The final surrender and the cost of war. Faced with atomic destruction and a massive Soviet invasion of Manchuria, the Japanese government finally accepted the inevitable. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito broadcast his first-ever address to his people, announcing the surrender. The formal surrender ceremony took place on September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. With the scratch of a pen, the most destructive conflict in human history came to an end. World War II had cost the lives of an estimated 60 million people. Poland had lost 20% of its population, the Soviet Union nearly 20 million people. Cities across Europe and Asia were leveled, and millions were left homeless and displaced. From the ruins emerged two new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, and a new global organization, the United Nations, born from the hope that such a catastrophe would never happen again. The echoes of World War II still resonate in the world we inhabit today. It is a reminder of the fragility of peace and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. If this journey through the archives helped you understand the gravity of our shared past, please show your support by hitting the like button. Sharing this documentary with your friends and family helps keep the memory of these monumental events alive for future generations. We want to hear from you. Leave your thoughts in the comments below and let us know which specific battle, leader, or hidden story of history you would like us to explore next. To ensure you never miss our upcoming deep dives and cinematic chronicles, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. We are committed to bringing you the most detailed and high-quality historical content on YouTube. Thank you for standing with us here at the War Archives. Until next time, keep exploring the past.